Most psychedelics are very physically safe, but they're not harmless. Whilst you might not quite turn into a glass of orange juice, well, there's a lot of real risks that come with taking these powerful substances. And I personally know how easy it is to react against the propaganda and go too far to the other end of the spectrum, claiming that psychedelics don't have very negative potential consequences. Today, we're going to talk about these risks and some simple solutions so that you can see both sides of this double-edged sword we call tripping more clearly. Okay, I will admit it's kind of funny that almost all of the biggest risks come from the fact that psychedelics are illegal. This by itself is the root cause of most, if not all of the points I make in this video, but that doesn't mean they're not there, and it also doesn't mean that legalizing them will solve all of these problems. In almost all countries on this planet, by simply possessing something like magic mushrooms, you run the risk of getting a fine, a criminal record, and maybe even jail time. There's even countries that will kill you for possessing these substances. Whilst you may just have your psychs for personal use, it can be hard to prove that you're not dealing if you have what your government considers to be a high amount, which might not actually be that much. I'd argue that most of the dangers you could face are simply going to come from a lack of education and research. I'll have a future video on how to do really great research, so make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Before ingesting any substance, you should have thoroughly researched it at the dose you're taking and the ROA you're using. Not just 10 minutes reading on Google, you should be spending hours making sure you're prepared and setting everything up safely. That means you don't have a family history of psychosis, you're not taking medications or drugs that could interact negatively with your psychedelic, and you know what you're getting into to the best extent that you can. There is very little incentive for your drug dealer to give a fuck about your health. If you've been sold a blotter tab, sure it could be LSD, but it could also be any of these and more. This is why you should always test your substances. Even then, there's no way to determine the purity without getting a lab test, which is also illegal in many countries. You should be testing every single batch, and you've also got to make sure you've got a scale. You can get a great 1mg scale for just 15 bucks. Though these scales can be really inaccurate when it comes to weighing anything less than 20 mg. So this is what you do. Find something lightweight and place it on your scale. Do not hit tear, instead record the weight and then add your substance. I hope you paid attention in school, because now you gotta do the new weight minus the original weight, and you should get a much more accurate reading. I really recommend you do this a bunch of times to make sure you've got the most accurate result possible, and if you're weighing super low doses and your scale is too inconsistent, then you can use volumetric dosing instead. Because of the war on drugs, which by the way, drugs are currently winning, most psychedelics have barely been studied. While something like psilocybin seems to be really safe, if not healthy under the right circumstances, most other research chemicals have barely been studied, if at all, and we simply don't know if they cause long-term damage. Now there is some good evidence that many of them probably don't. Alexander Shulgin experimented with all of these and he lived to the ripe old age of 88. He was actually just 15 days away from his 89th birthday. But of course, this isn't very scientific, and until we can study them properly over the long term, there's still a lot of unknowns, especially with the rarer, more obscure RCs. The infamous bad trip. Now a trip can be challenging and still have positive long-term results. In fact, most of them do, but not every trip does. Sometimes people are left more anxious or more depressed than they were before. This doesn't even necessarily have to come from a challenging trip, but it usually will, and whilst this is always a risk, you can reduce this risk by an extreme amount just by simply being responsible. That means tripping in a good, comfortable, safe setting. It means having a good set and intention. It means doing your research, going up slowly in dosages, and respecting the substance and so yourself. Some people might experience depersonalization, an existential crisis, delusions, nightmares, neurosis, a loss of motivation, trauma, and so much more. Though if you can integrate your experience, which is super important regardless of how your trip went, you can almost always overcome these and come out stronger on the other side. Unfortunately, many people don't integrate their experiences very well, and that can lead to a lot of unhealthy behaviors. This is ultimately the main reason I started this channel. I cannot stress enough how important integration is. When you're tripping, especially at the higher doses, it is vital you set up your environment so that it's safe. For example, I get rid of any knives, scissors, and other dangerous things for the duration of my trips. You do not want to put yourself in a situation where you can hurt yourself. If this means having a trip sitter, then so be it, though I wouldn't say it's necessary if you're just mindful that you're going to be in a radically vulnerable state and you prepare for that accordingly. Psychedelics are so powerful that they can change your entire perception. Many psychonauts will get this to a small extent, and it's often not a problem, but in rare cases, some people can be really negatively affected by this. It's not like you're gonna be seeing flying elephants, but something like visual snow can potentially get in the way of normal life. The good news is it's not too hard to avoid, just don't trip too often and be careful with heroic doses. I'm planning to make a whole video on this topic, so stay tuned. There's loads of other risks that don't really fit into these main categories, such as screaming until your neighbors call the cops, making mistakes in weighing your dose or mislabeling your drugs, factors out of your control like a natural disaster, addiction, and being allergic to a particular substance. The point is that there's still an infinite amount of risks I haven't talked about. But don't let this scare you. I could equally say that drinking water is risky because you might overhydrate, you might choke and die, your water could be contaminated, you might spill some, slip over and die, and worst of all, your sleeves might get wet. Ultimately, everything comes with risks, and it's up to us to be responsible and take that chance because we know the reward makes it worth it. Most of these risks are really avoidable, and even the ones that aren't can still be managed. It's not like you stop leaving the house because someone could just stab you at any moment. In my opinion, the best way to treat psychedelics is like a loaded gun. Don't underestimate their power because it's infinite. But if you're willing, then learn how to direct that power to benefit yourself and others. Ultimately, whether that power helps you or hurts you comes down to how you use it.